the real umbrella corporations that actually existed. In Resident Evil, the Umbrella Corporation stands as gaming's most iconic evil megacorp, a pharmaceutical company that creates bioweapons in secret labs, a business that views human beings as expendable test subjects, an organization so powerful it operates beyond government oversight, so ruthless it destroys entire cities to protect its secrets, so morally bankrupt it transforms children into monsters for profit. The Umbrella Corporation works because it feels impossible and inevitable at the same time. No company could actually be that evil, could it? No corporation would deliberately infect populations with diseases, experiment on prisoners without consent, or knowingly poison millions while denying responsibility. That's fiction. That's video game exaggeration. That's the stuff of nightmares, not board meetings, except it's not. The uncomfortable truth is that our world has produced corporations and government programs that rival or exceed Umbrella's fictional atrocities. Real organizations conducted human experiments. Actual companies knowingly poisoned populations, suppressed evidence, bribed scientists, corrupted regulators, and left mountains of corpses while executives collected bonuses. These weren't rogue operations run by madmen in abandoned facilities. These were respected institutions, household names, pillars of industry. They had shareholders and quarterly reports. They advertised on television. Their products sat in kitchen cabinets and medicine cabinets. Their logos meant trust and quality and scientific progress. Until the documents surfaced, until the whistleblowers came forward, until the bodies piled too high to ignore. This is about those organizations, the real umbrella corporations that existed not in Raccoon City, but in our cities. Not in a PlayStation horror game, but in documented history. Not as fiction, but as fact. We're going to walk through laboratories where prisoners were vivisected while conscious, corporate boardrooms where executives decided cancer warnings would hurt quarterly profits, government offices where bureaucrats traded human rights for scientific data. We're going to see what happens when the profit motive encounters zero oversight, when nationalism meets scientific capability, when corporations become more powerful than the governments meant to regulate them. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are matters of historical record, backed by internal documents, whistleblower testimony, court verdicts, government investigations. The corporations and agencies involved either admitted guilt, paid massive settlements, or were found liable in courts of law. Some of their executives went to prison, most didn't. Many of the companies still exist, operating under new names, spinning off liability through corporate restructuring, continuing business while the victims they created continue dying. What makes an organization a real-world umbrella corporation? Several common elements emerge across every example we'll examine. First, knowledge of harm. These weren't accidents. Internal documents prove the organizations knew their products or programs were causing severe damage to human health, often decades before public awareness. Second, deliberate concealment. They didn't just fail to report the problems, they actively suppressed research, destroyed evidence, intimidated scientists, captured regulatory agencies, and ran disinformation campaigns to protect profits. Third, continued operation. Even after becoming aware of the harm, they escalated rather than stopped, choosing to maximize profit during the window before accountability arrived. Fourth, targeting of vulnerable populations. Whether prisoners, impoverished minorities, farmers, or their own employees, these organizations exploited people without power or voice. Fifth, regulatory capture or immunity. Through lobbying, bribes, or government collaboration, they operated beyond meaningful oversight. And finally, the aftermath. When caught, they deployed armies of lawyers. They settled cases with gag orders. They restructured to avoid liability. They paid fines that represented tiny fractions of their profits. The people responsible rarely faced criminal charges. The victims rarely received adequate compensation. And the companies, more often than not, continued operating. This is not a story about evil for evil's sake. These weren't supervillains pursuing chaos. They were rational actors pursuing profit within a system that made atrocity logical. Every horror we'll examine made perfect sense from within the decision-making framework of the organization committing it. Test drugs on prisoners without consent, cheaper than proper clinical trials. Suppress evidence that your product causes cancer, better than losing market share. Dump toxic waste into drinking water, more profitable than proper disposal. Lobby to prevent regulation, standard business practice. The banality of it is perhaps more disturbing than the malice Umbrella Corporation displays. At least Umbrella's executives knew they were villains. The real-world equivalents convinced themselves they were serving shareholders, feeding the world, defending the nation, advancing science. So let us walk through these case studies. Let us see what actual umbrella corporations looked like. Let us examine how they operated, what they did, how they got away with it, and what fragments of accountability finally emerged. Let us begin not with pharmaceutical companies, but with a military unit that fused nationalist fervor, scientific ambition, and genocidal racism into something that makes Umbrella's experiments look restrained by comparison. Let us begin with Unit 731, Japan's laboratory of horrors, between 1936 and 1945 in the Pingfang district of Japanese-occupied Manchuria. A secret facility operated Unit 731, officially titled the Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Unit of the Kwantung Army. It was commanded by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a microbiologist who had convinced the Japanese military that biological warfare represented the future of combat. What occurred within those walls represents perhaps the most extensive program of lethal human experimentation in recorded history. An estimated 3,000 prisoners died in the Pingfang facility alone. Countless more died in field tests across China. Some historians place the total death toll above 10,000, though accurate numbers remain elusive since the Japanese destroyed most records when the war ended. The facility was massive. More than 150 buildings sprawled across 6 square kilometers, housing for over 3,000 personnel, laboratories equipped with cutting-edge equipment, barracks for researchers, and prisons for test subjects, people who would never leave alive, people the researchers called Maruta, logs. The term reveals the mindset. These were not human beings but raw materials, objects to be processed and studied. The dehumanization was total, deliberate, essential. You cannot vivisect a conscious person if you still think of them as a person. Shiro Ishii understood this. A brilliant scientist, an utterly ruthless pragmatist, he saw an opportunity others missed. Western powers had signed the Geneva Protocol in 1925, banning chemical and biological weapons. Japan signed as well, but Ishii reasoned that the ban itself proved the weapon's effectiveness. Why outlaw something unless it works? And if everyone had agreed not to develop such weapons, whoever did develop them in secret would possess an overwhelming advantage. Japan's occupation of Manchuria provided the perfect testing ground, remote enough to avoid scrutiny, populated by Chinese civilians and Soviet prisoners that Imperial Japan's ideology had already classified as subhuman. Ishii pitched his vision to military leadership: build a facility where researchers could conduct experiments impossible in Japan proper, develop weapons that could win wars without firing a bullet, and do it all beyond the reach of international observers. The military agreed. Unit 731 received lavish funding. Ishii recruited top medical researchers from Japan's most prestigious universities, offering them what scientists rarely get: unlimited resources, no ethical constraints, and the chance to answer questions no conventional research could address. What happens when you infect a living human with bubonic plague and track the disease's progression until death? Unit 731 could answer that. How long does a human body survive extreme cold, freeze prisoners outside until their limbs turn to ice, then test different thawing methods? What's the optimal delivery mechanism for distributing anthrax? Develop bombs designed to scatter bacteria, then test them on villages. How do diseases spread? Release plague-infected fleas into populated areas and monitor the results. The experiments read like a comprehensive encyclopedia of cruelty. Vivisection without anesthesia, because anesthetics might affect the data. Prisoners infected with syphilis, then dissected alive to watch the disease's progression in real time. Pregnant women infected with diseases, then vivisected to study fetal response. Forced rape to study sexually transmitted diseases. Exposure to mustard gas, phosgene, and other chemical weapons. Immersion in tanks of ice water to study hypothermia. Spinning in centrifuges until death. Exposure to lethal doses of X-rays. Injections of animal blood. Surgical removal of organs to see how long a person could survive. Limb amputations followed by reattachment to different body parts. Decompression chambers to see how much pressure change a human could withstand before eyes ruptured. Injections of horse urine into kidneys, not for any medical purpose, but simply to inflict suffering and observe the results. But Unit 731's primary focus was biological warfare. They bred plague-carrying fleas in massive quantities. At peak operation, they had approximately 4,500 flea incubators, each capable of producing at least 45 kilograms of fleas per breeding cycle. They produced plague bacteria by the ton. They developed bombs specifically designed to spread disease. They tested delivery methods, contaminated food, infected water supplies, aerial dispersal. Field tests were conducted on Chinese cities. Aircraft would drop bombs filled with plague-infected fleas over populated areas. Then researchers would monitor disease outbreaks, mortality rates, and spread patterns. When China and Japan clashed in border conflicts in the late 1930s, Unit 731 saw an opportunity. They dumped typhoid bacteria into water sources used by Soviet troops. The bacteria proved less effective than hoped in flowing water, but the experiment provided valuable data. The victims of Unit 731 were primarily Chinese, civilians captured by the Kempeitai military police, resistance fighters, suspected spies, anyone the occupation forces wanted to dispose of. But the subjects also included Koreans, Russians, Mongolians, and a handful of Allied prisoners of war, including Americans and British soldiers. Gender and age offered no protection. Women were subjected to rape and forced pregnancy to study disease transmission and fetal development. Children underwent the same tortures as adults. The unit maintained a steady supply of test subjects through agreements with the military police. When experiments killed prisoners, which all experiments did eventually, new subjects would arrive to replace them. What makes Unit 731 Particularly notable among historical atrocities is not just the suffering inflicted, but the scientific and medical establishment's complicity. These were not rogue psychopaths operating in shadows. These were respected researchers from major universities conducting peer-reviewed work, publishing papers. After the war, many Unit 731 researchers returned to prominent positions in Japanese academia and medicine. The network Ishii built during the war continued as professional connections in peacetime. Some became university department chairs. Others joined pharmaceutical companies. A few went into government public health roles. The medical skills they developed through atrocity translated seamlessly into civilian careers. This continuity was made possible by the American decision to grant immunity from prosecution. When World War II ended, the Soviets captured some Unit 731 personnel and put them on trial, resulting in convictions and prison sentences. But most of the unit, including Ishii himself, were in American-occupied territory. U.S. military intelligence officers interrogated them extensively, and what they learned created a dilemma. The biological warfare data Unit 731 had gathered was unique. No other organization had conducted such extensive human experimentation. No Western power had that information. And in the emerging Cold War, with the Soviet Union as the new enemy, that data suddenly had strategic value. The decision was made at high levels. The researchers would provide all their data, documents, photographs, findings from experiments, in exchange for immunity from war crimes prosecution. Lieutenant Colonel Arvo T. Thompson, one of the American investigators, later admitted they had been deceived during initial interrogations. Unit 731 personnel, coached by former members like Lieutenant Colonel Ryoichi Naito, who served as translator, had presented a coordinated script claiming all their work was defensive research only. The Americans eventually broke through the deception, but by then, the immunity deal framework was in place. General Ishii told interrogators that biological warfare was inhumane and would defile the virtue and benevolence of the emperor. This from a man who had overseen thousands of vivisections. Once the truth emerged, the Americans faced a choice: prosecute war criminals, but lose the data and risk it falling into Soviet hands, or secure the data through immunity grants and keep it from communist powers. They chose the data. A State War Navy Coordinating Committee task force acknowledged in August 1947 that Unit 731 activities violated the rules of land warfare and that the experiments were comparable to those for which Germans had been tried at Nuremberg. But they concluded that the strategic value of the information outweighed moral and legal considerations. One official statement noted that the value to the U.S. of Japanese biological warfare data is of such importance to national security as to far outweigh the value accruing from war crimes prosecution. Thus, none of Unit 731's leadership faced prosecution for their crimes. Shiro Ishii lived quietly in Tokyo until his death in 1959, working as an advisor on biological warfare for the American occupation forces. His subordinates scattered into medicine, academia, and industry. The victims received no acknowledgement, no compensation, no justice. Japan denied Unit 731's existence for decades. It wasn't until 1984 that Japan officially acknowledged the program. Not until 2002 did a Japanese court rule that the Imperial Army had indeed used biological weapons and caused harm to civilians, though the court dismissed compensation claims. Not until 2018 did the Japanese government release names of Unit 731 members, publishing a list of 3,607 personnel as part of the National Archives. The scientific data that seemed so valuable proved less useful than hoped. Much of it was methodologically flawed, using test subjects who were malnourished prisoners, subjected to stress and trauma, and often already dying from previous experiments made it difficult to draw conclusions applicable to healthy human populations. The pathogen exposure studies were well documented, but their military applications were limited. Biological weapons proved difficult to control in practice. The diseases could spread unpredictably. Environmental factors affected viability, and by the time the data was fully analyzed, nuclear weapons had already rendered conventional warfare calculations obsolete. The Americans got what they paid for: comprehensive documentation of human suffering, but it didn't offer the strategic advantage they imagined. What Unit 731 shares with our fictional umbrella corporation is the transformation of medicine into weapon, the treatment of human beings as experimental material, and the assumption that scientific progress justifies any cost. But Unit 731 operated on a scale and with a systematic brutality that exceeds most fiction. Umbrella's experiments were rogue corporate research. Unit 731 was government sanctioned, military operated, university staffed, and internationally protected through political immunity. The people who committed these atrocities were not movie villains. They were doctors and scientists, husbands and fathers, people who went home after work and lived normal lives. That normalization of horror is perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Anyone can imagine a sadistic monster committing atrocities. It's harder to imagine the careful researcher, the dedicated physician, the patriotic soldier systematically torturing thousands while considering themselves honorable servants of their nation. Unit 731 reminds us that institutional evil doesn't require individual malice. It requires the right incentives, the right framing, the right target population that's been sufficiently dehumanized, and the absence of accountability. Given those conditions, ordinary people will commit extraordinary horrors while sleeping soundly afterward. That's the lesson fiction rarely captures because it's too bleak, too challenging to the idea that we're different, that we would never. But history suggests otherwise. History suggests that under the right conditions, the research lab becomes a death camp, and the white coat becomes the uniform of atrocity. Tuskegee, the 40-year betrayal. If Unit 731 represents what military medical collaboration produces without oversight, the Tuskegee syphilis study demonstrates what happens when government researchers view impoverished minorities as convenient test subjects. Between 1932 and 1972, 40 years, the United States Public Health Service conducted an observational study of untreated syphilis in black men living in rural Alabama. 400 men with latent syphilis, plus 200 without the disease as a control group. The premise was ostensibly to document the natural progression of syphilis when left untreated. But the reality was far more sinister. The men were never told they had syphilis. They were told they had bad blood, a vague local term that could mean anything from anemia to fatigue to syphilis. They were promised free medical exams, free meals, and burial insurance in exchange for participation. What they weren't promised, what they weren't given, was actual medical treatment. Even after penicillin became widely available as a cure for syphilis in the mid 1940s, the men in the study were deliberately denied access to it. Researchers wanted to observe the full progression of untreated disease. Interrupting that progression with effective medicine would compromise the data. So, for nearly 30 additional years after a cure existed, these men suffered and died from a disease that could have been cured with a simple course of antibiotics. The study only ended in 1972 when whistleblower Peter Buxton leaked details to the press, triggering a public outcry that forced its termination. By the time the study ended, the human cost was staggering. Of the original 399 men with syphilis, 28 had died directly from the disease. 100 more died from complications related to it. 40 of the participants' wives had been infected during the study. 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. The study's initial goal was to last 6 months to a year, then treat the participants and analyze the data. But when funding for treatment was lost, researchers decided to simply continue observing. The men, already enrolled, already monitored, already trusting their government doctors, became permanent test subjects. None were ever given informed consent. None were told the truth about their condition. None were offered treatment even when it became available. The study was initiated by Dr. Taliaferro Clark, head of the Venereal Disease Division of the Public Health Service. His stated goal was simple: document what happens when syphilis goes untreated. But the context reveals darker motivations. The study took place in Macon County, Alabama, where poverty was endemic, literacy was low, and the black population had virtually no access to health care. The researchers operated from explicitly racist assumptions. Medical literature of the time asserted that black people were more susceptible to venereal diseases due to their race, that they had different disease manifestations than whites, that they were less interested in receiving medical care. These assumptions shaped study design and justified treating black men differently than white patients. When the study began, there was no known cure for syphilis. Treatments existed, primarily compounds containing arsenic and bismuth, but they were painful, dangerous, and often ineffective. So observing disease progression in an untreated population had some scientific merit, at least in principle. But by the mid-1940s, penicillin had proven highly effective against syphilis. It was safe, readily available, and had become the standard treatment. At that point, any ethical researcher would have immediately treated the study participants and published the data already collected. Instead, the Public Health Service continued the study without modification. The men received placebos, aspirin, vitamin tonics, told these were treatments for their bad blood. In reality, they received no therapeutic intervention whatsoever. The study continued through multiple administrations, multiple directors of the Public Health Service, multiple review periods. It was not secret. Articles were published in mainstream medical journals throughout its 40-year duration. A 1936 article in the Journal of the American Medical Association described the early findings. Subsequent papers appeared every 4 to 6 years. In 1964, the Archives of Internal Medicine published the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis, the 30th year of observation. The title alone should have raised alarms. How could a 30-year observation of untreated disease be ethically justified when treatment existed? Yet no medical professional published letters of concern. No ethics boards reviewed the study. No regulatory body intervened. Peter Buxton, a public health service investigator working in San Francisco, first learned about Tuskegee in the mid-1960s. He was horrified and immediately raised concerns with his superiors. The response was to form a review committee, not to stop the study, but to determine whether it should continue. The committee concluded it should. They argued that the data would be most valuable if the study continued until all participants had died and been autopsied. Buxton pushed back, arguing the study was unethical and indefensible. His concerns were dismissed. The study continued. Finally, in 1972, Buxton leaked the story to journalist Jane Heller of the Associated Press. Her article, published in July of that year, caused immediate national outrage. How could the government deliberately withhold treatment from sick men? How could this happen in America? The backlash was swift. The Assistant Secretary for Health and Scientific Affairs appointed an ad hoc advisory panel to review the study. The panel concluded it was ethically unjustified. In October 1972, the panel advised ending the study immediately. In November, it officially ceased, 40 years after it began. The aftermath involved attempts at remediation and accountability. In 1974, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of the study participants and their families. The suit was settled out of court in 1975 for $10 million. Living syphilitic participants received $37,500 each. Heirs of deceased participants received $15,000. The control group members received compensation as well, since they too had been deceived and denied treatment for other health issues. The settlement also established the Tuskegee Health Benefit Program to provide lifetime medical benefits to participants, wives, widows, and children. But money cannot restore health. It cannot erase 40 years of suffering. It cannot bring back the children born with congenital disabilities. It cannot cure the wives who were infected because their husbands didn't know they carried a disease. And perhaps most insidiously, it cannot repair the damage done to trust between black communities and public health institutions. The Tuskegee study became a symbol, a shorthand for medical racism and government betrayal. Its legacy appears in lower vaccination rates, reduced participation in clinical trials, hesitancy toward public health initiatives. Decades of research have documented how knowledge of Tuskegee correlates with medical mistrust and worse health outcomes in black populations. The study's architects wanted scientific data about disease progression. What they created was a multi-generational wound in public health trust. President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology in 1997 stating, "The United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. It is not only in remembering that shameful past that we can make amends and repair our nation, but it is in remembering that past that we can build a better present and a better future." His administration announced plans to establish the Tuskegee University National Center for Bioethics in Research and Healthcare. These were important symbolic gestures, but they came 25 years after the study ended, 65 years after it began. What makes Tuskegee particularly relevant to our examination of real umbrella corporations is not the initial decision to study untreated disease, ethically questionable, but arguably defensible in 1932 before effective treatment existed, but rather the continued operation after 1947. Once penicillin proved effective, continuing the study became an act of deliberate harm. Researchers knew they were denying participants life-saving treatment. They knew men were dying who could be saved. They knew wives were being infected, who could have been protected. They chose to let it happen because stopping would compromise the data. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947 following the Nazi medical trial, outlined clear principles for ethical human experimentation. Yet there's no evidence the Tuskegee study was ever reviewed in light of Nuremberg standards. It simply continued, operating in plain sight, documented in medical journals, funded by government appropriations, supervised by career bureaucrats who considered it perfectly legitimate research. The banality of its evil matches anything in fiction. These were not sadistic experimenters. They were public health professionals, many genuinely committed to fighting disease, but they had been taught that black patients were fundamentally different, less intelligent, less worthy of full medical care. Those racist assumptions made it possible to view the study participants not as people being harmed, but as subjects being studied. The cognitive dissonance was resolved through dehumanization. Once you accept that these men are not quite fully human, or at least not fully deserving of the same ethical consideration as white patients, the rest follows logically. Denying them treatment becomes data collection rather than medical malpractice. Lying about their condition becomes necessary study protocol rather than fraud. Allowing them to infect their wives becomes acceptable risk rather than knowing harm. Tuskegee reveals how institutional racism transforms healthcare into abuse. It demonstrates that you don't need a for-profit motive to create an umbrella corporation scenario. Government agencies pursuing scientific knowledge can be just as destructive when they operate without accountability, when they view certain populations as acceptable casualties, when they prioritize data over human dignity. The study also reveals the weakness of professional ethics as a safeguard. For 40 years, doctors and researchers participated in or knew about this study. For 40 years, they said nothing, did nothing, allowed it to continue. Some actively defended it when questioned. Others simply looked away. The medical profession's silence was as damaging as the study itself. It suggested that professional ethics, without legal enforcement, are insufficient protection against institutional abuse. The Hippocratic Oath proved meaningless when career advancement and scientific curiosity pointed toward continuing the harm. The final participant of the Tuskegee study died in 2004. Their lifetime spanned nearly the entire 20th century, from Jim Crow segregation through the civil rights movement to the internet age, and for 40 of those years, their government used them as unwitting test subjects in an experiment that could have ended at any point, that should have ended decades before it did, but continued because nobody with power chose to stop it. MK Ultra, the mind control conspiracy that was real. If Tuskegee demonstrated government, researchers exploiting the powerless, Project MK Ultra revealed what happens when intelligence agencies decide all ethical constraints are obstacles to national security. Between 1953 and 1973, the Central Intelligence Agency operated a sprawling, multi-million-dollar program dedicated to developing mind control techniques. Over 150 sub-projects, more than 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, thousands of unwitting test subjects, experiments involving LSD, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, electroshock, verbal abuse, sexual humiliation, and any other method researchers thought might break down personality and rebuild it according to CIA specifications. When congressional investigations finally exposed MK Ultra in 1975, the American public learned their intelligence agency had been running programs that sounded like dystopian fiction. MK Ultra was created and overseen by Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who joined the CIA in the early 1950s. His official title was Chief of the Chemical Division of the Technical Services Staff. His unofficial role was finding ways to control human minds. The Cold War context is essential. The Korean War had recently ended, and stories circulated about American POWs who had apparently been brainwashed by Chinese and North Korean captors, making propaganda statements and even refusing repatriation. Whether these stories reflected actual mind control or simply propaganda and coercion remains debated, but CIA officials took them seriously. If communist powers had developed techniques to reprogram human minds, America needed the same capability. And if the enemy didn't actually have such techniques yet, America should develop them first. Director Allen Dulles approved Project MK Ultra in April 1953. The name itself was a cryptonym. MK denoted the CIA's technical services staff. Ultra was pulled from a dictionary and meant nothing specific. The project's mandate was broad: research drugs, biological agents, and psychological techniques that could be used during interrogations to weaken individuals, force confessions, and control behavior. The ultimate goal was creating something like a truth serum, or better yet, a method to completely erase someone's personality and reprogram them as a willing asset. Gottlieb called it wiping the slate clean. The CIA had gotten interested in LSD specifically after learning that the Swiss pharmaceutical company Sandoz was producing the drug. In 1953, concerned that Soviet agents might purchase the world's supply and use it as a weapon, the CIA arranged to buy all available LSD, approximately 10 kilograms, enough for 100 million doses, for $240,000, about 4.2 million in today's money. Later, pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly synthesized LSD for the CIA, providing an unlimited supply. Gottlieb had his chemical, now he needed to test it. Testing took multiple forms. Some experiments were conducted in controlled settings with willing volunteers. CIA employees took LSD to experience its effects. Military personnel participated in studies, though often under coercion. They were told refusal could result in court-martial and threatened with discipline if they revealed anything about the tests. Academic researchers at major universities received grants through CIA front organizations to study LSD's effects on students, psychiatric patients, and prison inmates, often without knowing the funding source. But Gottlieb wanted to test LSD on unwitting subjects. He believed controlled studies couldn't replicate real-world interrogation scenarios where the target wouldn't know they'd been drugged. So the CIA created Operation Midnight Climax, in which they set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York, staffed by prostitutes on the CIA payroll. The prostitutes would bring clients back to the apartments, dose their drinks with LSD, and then CIA agents watching through one-way mirrors would observe the effects. The operation continued for years, creating detailed records of how LSD affected people who had no idea they'd consumed a powerful psychedelic drug. Other experiments were more invasive. Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, a psychiatrist at McGill University's Allen Memorial Institute, conducted extensive MK Ultra research funded through front organizations. Cameron believed he could erase problematic behaviors and memories through psychic driving, a process involving massive doses of LSD, electroshock therapy far exceeding standard medical practice, and playing tape-recorded messages to unconscious patients for weeks at a time. Patients admitted for relatively minor issues like anxiety or postpartum depression were subjected to treatment that left many with permanent memory loss, unable to recognize family members or recall major life events. Cameron's experiments destroyed lives while producing no useful intelligence techniques. One patient was kept in a drug-induced coma for 88 consecutive days. Another received 101 electroshock treatments over a period of weeks. The CIA funded this work for years. Prisons provided another captive population. At the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, the CIA tested LSD on inmates. One prisoner, later identified as organized crime figure James Whitey Bulger, described the experience. 8 convicts in a panic and paranoid state, total loss of appetite, hallucinating. The room would change shape. Hours of paranoia and feeling violent. We experienced horrible periods of living nightmares and even blood coming out of the walls. Guys turning to skeletons in front of me. I saw a camera change into the head of a dog. I felt like I was going insane. The CIA didn't inform prisoners what drug they were receiving, how long effects would last, or whether there might be permanent psychological consequences. Bulger and others received LSD repeatedly over months, creating extended periods of hallucinogenic terror they couldn't escape or understand. Mental patients represented another vulnerable population. In one Kentucky facility, CIA funded researchers kept a patient on LSD for 174 consecutive days. The cumulative effects of such prolonged exposure were unknown and unstudied. The patient was essentially a long term drug experiment. Other psychiatric facilities participated in similar research. Patients who could not consent, who could not refuse, who had no advocates became test subjects for compounds and procedures that would never receive approval through legitimate medical research channels. The scope of MK Ultra extended beyond LSD. Subprojects investigated mescaline, psilocybin, barbiturates, amphetamines, and combinations thereof. They tested sensory deprivation, locking subjects in isolation chambers, sometimes suspended in water, sometimes in complete darkness and silence, tracking how long before personality breakdown occurred. They experimented with hypnosis, trying to determine if post-hypnotic suggestion could make someone commit crimes or reveal secrets. They investigated electromagnetic fields, suboral frequencies, and other methods that might affect brain function. One sub-project, innocuously titled Sub-Project 54, was the Navy's perfect concussion program, attempting to use sound waves to erase memory. It was never successfully implemented. Throughout these experiments, the lack of informed consent was consistent. In some cases, subjects knew they were participating in research, but were deceived about what that research entailed. In many cases, they had no idea they were test subjects at all. The CIA operated on the principle that genuine mind control research required genuine surprise. Telling someone they were about to be drugged or hypnotized would compromise results. Therefore, the research required deception. Therefore, informed consent was impossible. The logical endpoint of this reasoning was the complete abandonment of research ethics. The program's secrets began to unravel in 1973. As the Watergate scandal engulfed the Nixon administration, CIA Director Richard Helms grew concerned about investigations into intelligence agencies. Knowing that MK Ultra would not withstand public scrutiny, he ordered all files destroyed. Sidney Gottlieb personally drove to the CIA records facility and oversaw the destruction of boxes upon boxes of MK Ultra documentation. Most of the program's details were successfully erased. However, in 1977, through a Freedom of Information Act request by journalist John Marks, researchers discovered approximately 8,000 pages of financial records that had been mislabeled and escaped destruction. These documents, mostly receipts and transaction records, confirmed the program's existence and provided fragments of detail about sub-projects and funding. Congressional hearings followed. The Church Committee, investigating illegal CIA activities, devoted attention to MK Ultra. Testimony revealed disturbing details, particularly around the 1953 death of Dr. Frank Olson, an Army scientist who died falling from a hotel window. For years, his death was treated as suicide. The hearings revealed that 9 days before his death, Olson had been dosed with LSD without his knowledge during a CIA retreat. He spiraled into paranoia and depression. When he sought to resign from the program, CIA officials sent him to New York for psychiatric evaluation. He jumped, or was pushed. Some family members contest the official story from his hotel room. In 1975, after these details emerged, President Ford personally apologized to Olson's family, and the government paid $750,000 in compensation. But questions about the circumstances of his death persist. Throughout the hearings, CIA officials claimed they couldn't remember details. Documents had been destroyed, files were lost, participants had died or retired. The systematic destruction of evidence meant that full accountability became impossible. We know MK Ultra existed. We know its basic parameters. We know specific horrors from testimony and surviving fragments. But the complete picture, how many people were tested on, how many were permanently harmed, how many died from experiments, remains unknown and probably unknowable. What did the CIA learn from 2 decades and millions of dollars spent on mind control research? Effectively, nothing. By the early 1960s, Dulles and Gottlieb concluded that true mind control was impossible. You couldn't erase someone's personality and reprogram them as an asset. You couldn't create a truth serum that reliably forced confessions. LSD was too unpredictable. It made some people suggestible, but others paranoid and violent. Sensory deprivation broke people down, but didn't provide control over the resulting behavior. Hypnosis had limited effectiveness and couldn't make people act against their fundamental nature. Every technique either failed to produce reliable results or caused effects that made the subject useless for intelligence purposes. The program was a scientific and practical failure. It generated reams of data about how to torture people, but no useful interrogation techniques. The legacy of MK Ultra extends beyond its direct victims. It contributed to the 1960s counterculture's use of psychedelic drugs. Many of the writers, artists, and activists who championed LSD as consciousness expanding had first encountered it through CIA-funded experiments at universities. Author Ken Kesey participated in an MK Ultra study at Stanford and credited it with inspiring his work. The Grateful Dead sound engineer Owsley Stanley synthesized LSD that flowed through the hippie movement. The CIA's effort to weaponize psychedelics inadvertently launched them into recreational use. The results were more far-reaching than any mind control program could have achieved. MK Ultra also established a template for later revelations about government overreach. It proved that conspiracy theories were sometimes true, that intelligence agencies really did conduct secret experiments on American citizens, that official denials meant nothing, and that accountability would only come through whistleblowers and leaked documents. Every subsequent intelligence scandal has played out in MK Ultra's shadow. When the public learns about warrantless surveillance, black site torture, or domestic spying, the reaction is shaped by knowing the CIA once dosed unwitting citizens with hallucinogens and destroyed the evidence. The connections to Umbrella Corporation are obvious, a powerful organization operating beyond oversight, using vulnerable populations for experiments, destroying evidence when exposure threatens, and facing minimal consequences when caught. But MK Ultra differs in one crucial aspect. It was a government program, not corporate profit-seeking. The evil was bureaucratic, strategic, nationalistic. The perpetrators believed they were protecting America from existential threats. That self-righteousness may be more dangerous than corporate greed because it justifies any atrocity as necessary defense. At least Umbrella's executives knew they were villains pursuing profit. MK Ultra's architects convinced themselves they were patriots pursuing security. The men who dosed Frank Olson slept soundly, believing they'd served their country. Sidney Gottlieb retired in 1973, the same year MK Ultra ended and its files were destroyed. He lived quietly until his death in 1999, occasionally interviewed by journalists but never prosecuted, never held accountable. When asked about his work late in life, he expressed regret about causing harm, but insisted the context of the Cold War justified the research. He was, in his own mind, a good man who had done distasteful but necessary work. That self-conception, the bureaucrat who commits atrocities while maintaining personal decency, may be the most chilling aspect of the entire program. Evil doesn't require monsters. It just requires ordinary people with security clearances, research funding, and the certainty that their cause justifies their methods. E.g. Farben, Hitler's chemical empire. Before there were pharmaceutical corporations denying their products caused cancer, there was I.G. Farben, a chemical conglomerate so deeply embedded in Nazi Germany's industrial machinery that it became synonymous with corporate collaboration in genocide. Formed in 1925 through the merger of Germany's six largest chemical companies, I.G. Farben grew into one of the world's most powerful corporations, producing everything from dyes to pharmaceuticals to synthetic rubber. When the Nazis took power in 1933, I.G. Farben quickly aligned itself with the regime, purging Jewish employees, funding Nazi candidates, and ultimately becoming essential to Germany's war effort. The company didn't just supply materials for war. It built and operated its own concentration camp. It tested drugs on inmates, and a subsidiary produced the poison gas used to murder over 1 million people in extermination camps. The merger that created I.G. Farben made business sense. Chemical production benefits from vertical integration. Why compete when you can consolidate? The combined entity controlled German chemical markets and competed globally, but the company's leadership made a crucial calculation when Hitler rose to power. They could resist the Nazis and risk marginalization, or they could collaborate and profit. They chose profit. Jewish scientists and executives who had helped build these companies were systematically purged. Some emigrated, some were sent to camps. By 1938, no Jews remained employed at I.G. Farben. The company had Aryanized itself completely, removing talent and expertise in exchange for Nazi approval. This collaboration deepened as Germany rearmed. I.G. Farben became central to the 4-year plan that prepared Germany for war. The company developed synthetic rubber to reduce dependence on natural rubber imports. It produced synthetic oil to fuel the Wehrmacht. It manufactured explosives, chemical weapons, and pharmaceuticals. The company's reach extended into every aspect of the war machine. Without I.G. Farben, Germany could not have sustained years of total war. The company's executives knew this and exploited it, extracting favorable contracts and monopolistic privileges in exchange for essential materials. In 1941, I.G. Farben decided to build a massive synthetic rubber and oil plant. The location chosen was Auschwitz in occupied Poland. Several factors made this attractive. Raw materials were accessible, rail connections were good, but most importantly, the nearby Auschwitz concentration camp provided an unlimited supply of slave labor. The company negotiated directly with the SS. Prisoners would be leased from the camp at a set daily rate, roughly 4 Reichsmarks per prisoner, paid directly to the SS. The prisoners themselves saw nothing. They were worked to death for the profit of I.G. Farben and the convenience of the SS. The I.G. Farben plant at Auschwitz became a horror in its own right. At peak operation, approximately 83,000 prisoners were forced to work at the facility. They built the factory under brutal conditions, inadequate food, impossible labor quotas, constant beatings. The company's own overseers were present, managing construction and operation alongside SS guards. When prisoners became too weak to work, they were simply returned to Birkenau, the extermination camp where they were murdered in gas chambers. The estimate is that at least 30,000 prisoners died as direct result of working for IG Farben, worked to death, beaten to death, or gassed when no longer productive. The plant was supposed to produce synthetic rubber and fuel. It cost approximately 900 million Reichsmarks and consumed vast resources. Despite all this investment, despite all the death, it produced almost nothing of military value. A small amount of fuel, no rubber at all. The plant was a failure by any measure except as an instrument of death. IG Farben executives toured the facility regularly. They saw the conditions, they saw the prisoners, they knew exactly what they were participating in. Testimony from workers and survivors confirms that IG Farben personnel didn't just passively benefit from slave labor, they actively participated in selections, choosing which prisoners were healthy enough to work and which should be sent to the gas chambers. But IG Farben's most infamous contribution to the Holocaust came through a subsidiary called DGESH, Deutsche Gesellschaft für Schädlingsbekämpfung, or German Corporation for Pest Control. DGESH produced Zyklon B, a pesticide based on hydrogen cyanide. Originally developed for fumigation, killing lice and insects in enclosed spaces, it had legitimate commercial uses. The Wehrmacht purchased it for delousing barracks and freight cars. Camps used it to fumigate clothing. But beginning in September 1941, the SS conducted experiments at Auschwitz using Zyklon B on human beings. 600 Soviet prisoners of war and 250 sick prisoners were locked in a sealed room and exposed to the gas. All died within minutes. The test was deemed successful. From that point forward, Zyklon B became the primary method of mass murder at Auschwitz-Birkenau and several other camps. Gas chambers disguised as shower rooms could kill approximately 2,000 people at a time. The process took minutes. Victims were told they were being deloused, instructed to undress and enter the showers, then sealed inside as SS personnel dropped Zyklon B pellets through vents. Death by asphyxiation occurred within 10 to 20 minutes. Bodies were then removed and burned in crematoria. The scale of murder enabled by Zyklon B is difficult to comprehend. Over 1 million people died this way. Jews, Roma, political prisoners, anyone the Nazis decided to exterminate. Sales records show that Zyklon B orders to Auschwitz increased dramatically during the period of mass extermination. Dagesh supplied Auschwitz with enough Zyklon B to murder the entire population killed there, and then some. The company's executives later claimed they didn't know the gas was being used for mass murder, but the volume orders alone should have raised questions. Additionally, the SS specifically requested that Dagesh supply Zyklon B without the warning odor additive normally included for safety, a modification that made sense only if you wanted to deceive victims about what they were breathing. Dagesh complied with these special requests, stripping the warning agent from shipments to death camps. At the Nuremberg trials following Germany's defeat, 23 IG Farben executives were prosecuted. The charges included planning and waging aggressive war, plundering occupied territories, slavery, and mass murder. The trial lasted 11 months. The verdicts, announced 1948, were mixed. 10 defendants were acquitted completely. 13 were convicted on various charges, receiving sentences ranging from 18 months to 8 years in prison. None were convicted of murder, though the prosecution presented extensive evidence of their knowledge and participation in atrocities. The judges concluded that while IG Farben executives knew about slave labor and profited from it, the prosecution had not proven direct responsibility for individual deaths. The Dagesh executives, including Karl Wurster, who served on both IG Farben's board and Dagesh's supervisory board, were acquitted of charges related to Zyklon B. The judges ruled that the prosecution had not shown these executives knew Zyklon B was being used for mass murder or had persuasive influence over Dagesh's operations. This finding is highly suspect. Modern historical research suggests knowledge of the mass murder using Zyklon B spread rapidly through IG Farben's ranks, including to senior management. But at Nuremberg, the benefit of doubt went to the defendants. Some of these acquitted executives went on to prominent post-war careers in German industry. Karl Wurster became chairman of BASF's supervisory board. Fritz Termeer, convicted at Nuremberg for slavery and plunder, serving 5 years, later became chairman of Bayer's supervisory board. IG Farben was officially dissolved by the Allies after the war, broken back into constituent companies. BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst, the core of the original conglomerate, re-emerged as independent entities and grew into pharmaceutical giants. Today, they're household names, respected corporations producing medications, chemicals, and agricultural products worth billions annually. Their connection to IG Farben is acknowledged in corporate histories but framed as a distant past, regrettable but not reflective of current operations. The companies argue that contemporary BASF and Bayer have no legal or moral continuity with their Nazi-era predecessors. Technically true, corporate structures were reorganized, leadership changed, decades have passed, but the wealth, the market position, the industrial capacity, the research base, all of that flowed directly from IG Farben to its successors. In recent years, some gestures toward accountability have emerged. BASF and Bayer have acknowledged their predecessors' roles in Nazi crimes. They funded historical research and memorial projects. In 2001, German corporations, including IG Farben's successors, contributed to a fund compensating former slave laborers. But these actions came 60 years after the crimes, long after most victims had died, long after the corporations had already benefited immensely from the work of people they helped murder. The compensation offered, a few $1,000s per survivor, is negligible compared to the profits extracted from slave labor or the decades of prosperity built on assets seized during the Nazi era. What makes IG Farben particularly relevant to our umbrella corporation comparison is the seamless integration of legitimate business and absolute evil. This wasn't a fringe operation or rogue division. It was mainstream, respectable German industry choosing to collaborate with genocide because the profit margins justified it. The same company that produced aspirin and antibiotics also leased concentration camp prisoners and supplied gas for mass murder. The executives who made those decisions weren't movie villains. They were respected businessmen, many with scientific or engineering backgrounds, pillars of their communities. After the war, most faced minimal consequences and returned to comfortable lives. This pattern, corporate collaboration with government atrocity, followed by weak accountability and continuation under new names, would repeat itself multiple times across the 20th century. But IG Farben was among the first, and remains the most stark example. When we imagine evil corporations in fiction, we imagine something like Umbrella, shadowy, secret, operating through front companies. IG Farben reveals the reality is less cinematic but more disturbing. Evil corporations are often openly visible, listed on stock exchanges, advertising in newspapers, employing thousands. They don't need secret labs when they can negotiate contracts directly with government agencies. They don't need to hide when legal systems and regulatory agencies actively enable their operations. The horror of IG Farben isn't that it operated in shadows, it's that it operated in plain sight, and that ordinariness is perhaps more frightening than any fictional conspiracy. Big Tobacco, the longest con. If IG Farben represents corporate collaboration with governmental atrocity, Big Tobacco demonstrates what happens when corporations pursue profit while knowing their product kills, employing every tool of deception, manipulation, and regulatory capture available to delay accountability for decades. For more than half a century, tobacco companies knew cigarettes caused cancer and other fatal diseases. They knew nicotine was addictive. They knew secondhand smoke harmed non-smokers. They knew their products killed hundreds of thousands annually, and they deliberately suppressed, distorted, and denied this knowledge while marketing aggressively to children and vulnerable populations, employing tactics so brazen and systematic that federal judges eventually found them guilty of racketeering, operating as a criminal enterprise under civil law. The story begins in the 1950s. By that decade, medical researchers had accumulated substantial evidence linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer. Multiple independent studies showed statistical correlations too strong to dismiss as coincidence. In 1952, Reader's Digest published an article titled Cancer by the Carton, summarizing the research for a popular audience. The article triggered public concern. Cigarette sales dipped slightly. The tobacco industry faced a crisis, not a health crisis, but a public relations crisis. The industry's response came in January 1954 with the frank statement to cigarette smokers, a full-page advertisement published in hundreds of newspapers nationwide. The statement claimed, "We believe the products we make are not injurious to health." It dismissed research linking smoking to lung cancer as inconclusive, stating there is no proof that cigarette smoking is one of the causes. The companies announced they were forming the Tobacco Industry Research Committee to fund independent research into smoking's health effects. This all sounded reasonable, concerned companies responding responsibly to public health questions. It was a lie from inception. Internal documents later revealed that the real purpose of the research committee was not to investigate smoking's dangers, but to create doubt about existing research, to fund studies that would muddy scientific consensus, and to provide ammunition for tobacco companies' lawyers and lobbyists. The committee didn't seek truth, it sought controversy. As long as the science remained debatable, regulation could be delayed and consumers could be kept uncertain. This became the industry's core strategy: manufacture doubt about established science, claim more research is needed, delay action while profits accumulated. Behind the public denials, tobacco companies were conducting their own research. They knew what they'd find, and they found it. Internal studies confirmed that cigarette smoke contained carcinogens. Internal studies confirmed that nicotine was addictive. Internal studies tracked exactly how addictive, using terms like extremely strong and more addictive than heroin. Company scientists understood the mechanisms, how nicotine bound to brain receptors, how repeated exposure created dependency, how withdrawal symptoms ensured continued consumption. Tobacco executives read these reports. Some were scientists themselves. They understood perfectly well what their products did. Philip Morris's position in 1964, stated publicly, was, "We don't accept the idea that there are harmful agents in tobacco." That same year, the U.S. Surgeon General released a report unequivocally concluding that cigarette smoking caused lung cancer. The evidence was overwhelming, based on decades of research across multiple countries and study methodologies. The tobacco industry dismissed the report and continued denying harm. They would maintain this position through the 1970s, 1980s, and into the 1990s, even as the evidence became so comprehensive that continued denial bordered on absurdity. The industry simultaneously pursued multiple deceptive strategies. First, they promoted light and mild cigarettes, marketing them with implied promises of reduced health risk. Advertising featured words like low tar and highlighted filter technology, suggesting these products were safer. Internal documents show executives knew this was false, that how people actually smoked these cigarettes, taking deeper drags, smoking more, meant they delivered similar tar and nicotine to regular cigarettes. But the marketing worked. Smokers who might have quit switched to lights instead, believing they'd reduced their risk. Second, they aggressively contested secondhand smoke dangers. By the 1970s and 1980s, research increasingly showed that non-smokers exposed to cigarette smoke faced elevated cancer and heart disease risks. This research threatened tobacco companies' profits directly. If secondhand smoke was dangerous, smoking bans in offices, restaurants, and public spaces became justified. The industry responded by funding research designed to cast doubt on secondhand smoke studies, and by creating front organizations that appeared independent but were actually tobacco funded. The Center for Indoor Air Research, established in 1988 by Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, and Laura Lard, was eventually declared by the U.S. Department of Justice to have been created to fraudulently mislead the American public about secondhand smoke dangers. Third, they denied nicotine addiction. This was perhaps the most egregious lie. Company research from the 1960s onward documented nicotine's addictive properties extensively. They knew it was more addictive than many illegal drugs. They manipulated nicotine levels in cigarettes to maintain addiction. They studied how to maximize nicotine delivery to the brain, yet when questioned under oath, they denied all of it. In 1994, the CEOs of 7 major tobacco companies testified before Congress. Representative Henry Waxman asked each whether they believed nicotine was addictive. All 7 said no. They claimed cigarettes were no more addictive than coffee or snack foods. One executive compared smoking to eating gummy bears. This testimony, later proven to be perjury through internal documents, became iconic footage. 7 businessmen lying in unison under oath. The documents proving this deception emerged through litigation. In the 1990s, states began suing tobacco companies to recover healthcare costs for treating smoking-related diseases. During discovery, plaintiffs obtained access to millions of pages of internal tobacco company documents. These papers, spanning decades, revealed the industry's knowledge, strategies, and deliberate deceptions in explicit detail. Memos discussed how to target teenagers. Research reports quantified nicotine addiction. Marketing plans outlined strategies to associate cigarettes with health, vigor, and freedom despite knowing the opposite was true. Email chains showed executives discussing how to suppress unfavorable research findings. In 1999, the U.S. Department of Justice sued major tobacco companies under RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, a law designed to prosecute organized crime. The suit alleged that tobacco companies had operated as a criminal enterprise, conspiring to deceive the public about their products' dangers. The case proceeded to trial in 2004. The evidence presented was overwhelming. In 2006, Judge Gladys Kessler issued a ruling finding the tobacco companies guilty on most counts. Her decision cataloged decades of fraud, including falsely denying that smoking causes disease, falsely denying that secondhand smoke causes disease, falsely denying that they manipulated nicotine levels to create and sustain addiction, falsely marketing light and low tar cigarettes as less harmful, targeting marketing toward children, suppressing research contrary to their public statements, destroying documents to avoid legal accountability. Judge Kessler's ruling ordered the companies to stop lying and to run corrective advertising campaigns admitting their deceptions. But legal appeals delayed implementation for years. Not until 2017, more than a decade after the verdict, did court-ordered corrective ads finally appear on television and in newspapers. The ads featured stark statements. A federal court has ruled that Altria, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco, Lorillard, and Philip Morris USA deliberately deceived the American public about the health effects of smoking. Similar statements addressed addiction, secondhand smoke, and low-tar cigarettes. In 2023, tobacco companies were finally required to post corrective statements at retail stores where cigarettes are sold. But even these corrective ads came decades too late. Millions had already died. The companies had already extracted trillions in profit. And critically, the companies had never actually stopped their harmful practices. They'd simply evolved them. As smoking rates declined in developed nations, Big Tobacco shifted focus to developing countries where regulation was weaker and populations were less aware of health risks. They marketed aggressively in Asia, Africa, and South America. They lobbied against international tobacco control measures. They fought every proposed regulation, warning labels, advertising bans, smoke-free laws, tooth and nail. One particularly revealing aspect of the tobacco industry's operation was Operation Berkshire, a conspiracy among major international tobacco companies beginning in 1977. The CEOs of Philip Morris, British American Tobacco, R.J. Reynolds, and others met secretly at Shockerwick House in the United Kingdom to coordinate a defensive strategy against mounting health concerns. They created front organizations like the International Committee on Smoking Issues, ICOSI, which coordinated lobbying and disinformation campaigns globally. The goal was to prevent countries from regulating tobacco by presenting a united front denying health risks, funding favorable research, and attacking unfavorable studies. Internal documents from this conspiracy are extraordinarily frank. One position paper noted the need for confidentiality and security because the companies would not wish the paper to fall into the wrong hands. Another document stated the assumption was a continuing smoking and health controversy, meaning they planned to maintain scientific doubt indefinitely. They explicitly rejected accepting a causal relationship between smoking and various diseases, instead maintaining the issue of causation remains controversial and unresolved. This, despite internal research confirming causation years earlier. Perhaps most damning, tobacco companies knew their products contained radioactive substances that accumulated in smokers' lungs and likely contributed to cancer. Studies from the 1960s onward identified polonium 210, a radioactive isotope, in cigarette smoke. The isotope accumulated in lung tissue, emitting carcinogenic radiation. Internal documents show tobacco companies conducted extensive research on this, quantifying radiation doses in smokers' lungs and considering methods to remove polonium 210 from tobacco. An acid wash technique proved effective at removing the radioactive material, but implementing it would have reduced nicotine absorption, potentially making cigarettes less addictive. The companies declined to adopt the technique, prioritizing addiction maintenance over cancer risk reduction. The final death toll from tobacco is staggering. The Centers for Disease Control estimates that cigarette smoking causes approximately 480,000 deaths annually in the United States alone, about 1 in 5 deaths nationwide. Globally, tobacco kills over 8 million people per year. The World Health Organization calls it the leading cause of preventable death worldwide. These aren't abstract statistics. These are individuals who contracted lung cancer, emphysema, heart disease, and dozens of other conditions caused primarily by smoking, conditions they might not have developed if tobacco companies had been honest about risks rather than spending decades denying, deceiving, and addicting. Big Tobacco exemplifies the umbrella corporation model in several ways. First, the systematic knowledge versus deception gap. They knew their product killed, conducted extensive internal research documenting exactly how, and then lied about it publicly for half a century. Second, the manipulation of regulatory systems through lobbying, campaign contributions, and captured officials. They prevented meaningful regulation for decades. Third, the targeting of vulnerable populations. They marketed heavily to children and racial minorities, groups with less power to resist. Fourth, the weaponization of science. They didn't deny research existed. They manufactured fraudulent research to create false controversy. Fifth, the eventual accountability was mostly financial rather than criminal. Executives avoided prison despite committing what courts found to be racketeering. The tobacco industry's crimes were so extensive, so well documented, and so clearly motivated by profit that other industries have studied their playbook. Climate denial campaigns use tobacco industry tactics. Pharmaceutical companies facing opioid litigation studied tobacco's legal strategies. Chemical manufacturers confronting pollution lawsuits examined how tobacco delayed accountability. The template Big Tobacco created, deny, delay, defend, has become standard corporate crisis management when product harm becomes undeniable. Yet tobacco companies still exist, still operate, still sell cigarettes globally. Philip Morris rebranded itself as Altria and spun off international operations. British American Tobacco continues as a major conglomerate. R.J. Reynolds merged with other companies and survives. They've pivoted to marketing reduced harm products like e-cigarettes and heat not burn devices, claiming they're trying to create a smoke-free future. Whether this represents genuine corporate reformation or simply the next iteration of deceptive marketing remains debatable. But one thing is certain: the companies that spent decades knowingly addicting and killing millions of people continue operating, continue profiting, and continue existing as legitimate businesses despite being found by federal courts to have operated as criminal enterprises. That continuation, that ability to commit documented atrocities and remain in business may be the most umbrella-like aspect of all. DuPont, the Teflon toxin. If Big Tobacco represents decades of deception about a product everyone knew was dangerous, DuPont's handling of PFAS chemicals demonstrates how corporations can poison the entire planet with substances the public has never heard of, suppress evidence of harm for generations, and when finally caught, use corporate restructuring to avoid paying for cleanup. DuPont's story centers on a chemical called C8, also known as PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid, one of thousands of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances collectively called PFAS or forever chemicals. These chemicals don't break down naturally. They accumulate in human bodies and persist in the environment for thousands of years. And DuPont knew they were toxic, knew they were contaminating water supplies, knew they were causing cancer and birth defects, and concealed this knowledge for decades while continuing and even expanding production. The story begins with Teflon. In 1938, DuPont chemist Roy Plunkett accidentally discovered polytetrafluoroethylene, PTFE, while experimenting with refrigerants. The substance had remarkable properties. It was extraordinarily slippery, heat resistant, and chemically inert. DuPont patented it as Teflon in 1945 and began producing it at the Washington Works plant in Parkersburg, West Virginia. Teflon became a commercial gold mine. By the 1960s, French engineers had applied it to cookware, creating non-stick pans. Soon Teflon coated everything: pots, pans, bakeware. Sales peaked at roughly $1 billion annually, but manufacturing Teflon required another chemical, perfluorooctanoic acid, C8. DuPont used C8 to smooth Teflon's lumpy texture during production. Initially, DuPont purchased C8 from 3M, but in 2002, when 3M phased out production after EPA pressure, DuPont simply started manufacturing C8 itself at a facility in North Carolina. The company couldn't produce Teflon without C8, and Teflon was too profitable to abandon. Internal documents, later obtained through litigation, reveal that DuPont's own research identified C8's toxicity remarkably quickly. In 1961, just a decade after starting to use the chemical, company toxicologists found that Teflon materials increased liver size in rats and rabbits at low doses. Dorothy Hood, chief of toxicology, warned in a memo that these materials should be handled with extreme care and that contact with the skin should be strictly avoided. In 1962, DuPont scientists asked volunteers to smoke cigarettes laced with C8. 9 of 10 in the highest dose group became noticeably ill, experiencing flu-like symptoms, including chills, backache, fever, and coughing that lasted an average of 9 hours. Further animal studies throughout the 1960s and 1970s found that C8 caused enlarged organs, particularly livers, kidneys, testes, and adrenal glands, classic responses to toxic exposure. A 1970 internal memo noted that Haskell Laboratory, DuPont's internal toxicology research facility, had found C8 to be highly toxic when inhaled and moderately toxic when ingested. In 1979, a private report for DuPont found that dogs exposed to a single dose of PFOA died 2 days after ingestion. Human evidence emerged in 1980. 2 of 8 pregnant DuPont employees working with C8 gave birth to children with birth defects, one with a nostril defect, another with eye abnormalities. DuPont and 3M were immediately aware these defects occurred in their C8 exposed workers at rates far exceeding background population levels. Yet DuPont assured employees in 1981 that we know of no evidence of birth defects caused by C8 at DuPont, despite the evidence sitting in their own medical files. By the early 1980s, DuPont's internal research team had also discovered that C8 was contaminating local water supplies. In 1984, the company secretly began collecting tap water from employees' homes, local schools, and businesses near the Washington Works plant. They found C8 in public drinking water in both Ohio and West Virginia at potentially dangerous levels. Internal meeting minutes from DuPont's corporate headquarters in Delaware reveal executives discussing this discovery. Notes from that meeting state, legal and medical will likely take the position of total elimination, but the executives present concluded that available pollution control methods were not economically attractive, so DuPont chose to continue. Rather than reduce C8 use or implement costly control systems, the company actually escalated production throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The Washington Works plant continued dumping C8-laden sludge in unlined landfills, allowing it to leach into groundwater and the Ohio River. The plant's smokestacks continued pumping C8-laced vapors into the air. Drinking water systems serving approximately 100,000 people in the mid-Ohio Valley became contaminated. None of this would have become public had a West Virginia cattle farmer named Wilbur Tennant not noticed something wrong. Tennant owned land adjacent to a landfill that DuPont had purchased from his family in the 1980s. The company told him it would be used as a non-hazardous waste site. Soon after dumping began, the creek running through his property, feeding directly into the Ohio River, turned black and developed foul odors. Sometimes foam floated on the water's surface. His cattle drank from that creek. Within a few years, about 280 of Tennant's cattle had died, many exhibiting bizarre symptoms: deformed organs, green internal organs, strange tumors, blackened teeth. Tennant tried to get local authorities interested. They dismissed him as a troublesome farmer. Veterinarians couldn't identify the cause of death. Nobody wanted to blame DuPont, one of the area's major employers. Finally, in 1998, Tennant hired attorney Robert Bilott from a Cincinnati firm. Bilott specialized in corporate defense, helping companies, not suing them. But Tennant was a family connection, so Bilott agreed to look into it. What Bilott discovered changed everything. Through litigation, he obtained access to thousands of internal DuPont documents. They detailed decades of knowledge about C8's toxicity, environmental contamination, and human health effects. They showed DuPont had known since the early 1980s that C8 was in drinking water, but had never notified anyone, not regulators, not local officials, not the public. They showed birth defects among workers' children that the company had documented but never reported. They showed studies on animals proving C8 caused cancer, yet the company publicly denied any health risks. In 2001, Bilott sent evidence packages to the EPA, the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, and the U.S. Attorney General. The revelations triggered multiple investigations and lawsuits. In 2004, the EPA fined DuPont $16.5 million for failing to report C8's health hazards, the largest civil penalty under environmental law at that time, but the fine represented a tiny fraction of Teflon's profits. And critically, the fine was for failure to report known problems, not for creating those problems in the first place. DuPont's decades of poisoning communities face minimal financial consequence relative to revenues generated. Meanwhile, independent research began studying C8's health effects in exposed populations. A scientific panel established through a 2005 class action settlement studied approximately 70,000 people in contaminated water districts. After years of research, the C8 science panel concluded there was a probable link between C8 exposure and several diseases: kidney cancer, testicular cancer, thyroid disease, pregnancy-induced hypertension, and ulcerative colitis. These weren't speculative findings. The panel consisted of 3 independent epidemiologists who spent years analyzing medical records and exposure data. Their conclusions meant that DuPont's chemical had measurably increased disease rates in tens of thousands of people. Individual lawsuits followed. In 2015, a jury awarded plaintiff Carla Bartlett $1.6 million after finding that her kidney cancer was caused by C8 in her drinking water. Other successful verdicts followed, establishing legal precedent that DuPont was liable for harm caused by C8. Faced with thousands more claims, DuPont sought a way out. The solution: corporate restructuring. In 2015, DuPont announced it would spin off its specialty chemicals division, the part of the company that made C8 and now made replacement chemicals for Teflon and other products. into a new corporation called Chemours. On paper, Chemours received 19% of DuPont's business operations, but approximately two-thirds of its environmental liabilities and 90% of pending litigation. DuPont shareholders kept 81% of the profitable business, while Chemours absorbed most of the legal exposure. Because Chemours was much smaller and had limited assets, plaintiffs worried it might declare bankruptcy if judgments grew too large, leaving victims uncompensated. This liability shuffling represents a common corporate tactic: restructure to avoid paying for past harms, create a new entity, transfer the liabilities to it, and if that entity collapses under the legal burden, the parent company shrugs and claims it's separate. Plaintiffs sued over this structure, arguing DuPont was deliberately making itself judgment proof. The litigation continues, but the fundamental problem remains. The company that profited most from C8 has legally distanced itself from responsibility for cleanup and compensation. The contamination DuPont created isn't limited to West Virginia and Ohio. C8 and related PFAS chemicals are now found in blood samples from approximately 98% of Americans. They're in Arctic polar bears. They're in umbilical cord blood. They're in breast milk. They're called forever chemicals because they persist indefinitely. Even if all production stopped today, the chemicals already released would remain in the environment for thousands of years, continuing to accumulate in organisms that drink water or eat food containing them. The EPA now estimates that PFAS contamination affects drinking water for over 100 million Americans. Military bases where firefighting foam was used are heavily contaminated. Industrial sites where PFAS were manufactured or processed have created contamination plumes extending for miles. Cleanup costs are estimated in the tens of billions of dollars, yet the companies that profited from manufacturing and using these chemicals have paid only a fraction of that. DuPont's handling of C8 exemplifies multiple umbrella corporation characteristics. First, they knew early. Research from the 1960s and 1970s established toxicity clearly. Second, they concealed the knowledge. They didn't inform regulators, communities, or their own employees about the scope of the problem. Third, they continued and escalated production despite knowing the harm. When they learned water was contaminated, they decided cleanup was not economically attractive and kept dumping. Fourth, they targeted vulnerable populations. The people drinking contaminated water in West Virginia and Ohio were mostly rural, working class communities without resources to investigate or fight back. Fifth, when caught, they used legal and corporate maneuvering to minimize consequences: relatively small fines, drawn out litigation, liability transfer through restructuring. The most chilling parallel to Umbrella is perhaps the scale of contamination. Umbrella Corporation releases bioweapons that spread through populations. DuPont released chemicals that are now in virtually every human body on Earth. Umbrella's experiments create localized outbreaks. DuPont's chemicals have contaminated the entire planet irreversibly. And while Umbrella operates through obviously evil intentionality, DuPont operated through mundane corporate logic: maximize profit, externalize costs, delay accountability. The result is global poisoning, but without dramatic moments of decision, just quarterly reports, cost benefit analyses, and choices to continue doing what made money. Robert Bilott, the lawyer who exposed DuPont's crimes, his story was told in the 2019 film Dark Waters. But despite his efforts and the hundreds of lawyers who have followed his lead, accountability remains incomplete. DuPont paid settlements but continues operating. PFAS cleanup proceeds slowly, funded inadequately. Victims receive compensation decades after exposure, if they're still alive to receive it, and the chemicals remain in the environment, in our bodies, in the blood of every child born today, a permanent contamination that will outlast our civilization. That, perhaps more than any fictional bioweapon, represents the ultimate umbrella corporation scenario, irreversible damage to the entire biosphere, committed by a respected company in pursuit of profit. Monsanto, from war crimes to weed killer. If DuPont contaminated the planet with chemicals people didn't know existed, Monsanto accomplished something arguably more audacious. It knowingly poisoned millions with products people trusted, while convincing farmers and governments that its pesticides were essential to feeding the world. Monsanto's legacy spans Agent Orange in Vietnam, genetically modified crops designed to withstand its herbicides, and Roundup, the world's most widely used weed killer, now linked to cancer in thousands of lawsuits and billions in damages. Monsanto began as a chemical company in 1901. By the 1960s, it had become a major player in agricultural chemicals. When the U.S. military needed herbicides to clear Vietnamese jungles and destroy enemy crops, Monsanto was among the companies that answered the call. Agent Orange, a mixture of herbicides containing dioxin, was deployed extensively between 1962 and 1971 as part of Operation Ranch Hand. The military sprayed approximately 20 million gallons across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The goal was defoliation, eliminating tree cover where enemy soldiers could hide, destroying crops that might feed them. The chemical worked. Vast areas of jungle were stripped bare, rice paddies were poisoned, but Agent Orange also devastated human populations. Vietnamese civilians exposed to the spray developed cancers, immune disorders, and birth defects that appeared in subsequent generations. American soldiers who handled the chemical or operated in sprayed areas faced similar health problems. Hodgkin's disease, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, respiratory cancers, Parkinson's disease, type 2 diabetes, and others. The dioxin in Agent Orange was extraordinarily persistent and toxic. It bioaccumulated in fatty tissues and crossed placental barriers, affecting fetuses. Monsanto and other manufacturers knew dioxin was dangerous. Internal documents from the Agent Orange production period show awareness of toxicity, but the military needed defoliants, the companies had contracts, and wartime urgency overrode safety concerns. After the war, veterans began developing diseases at alarming rates. They sued, leading to a massive class action settlement in 1984. Monsanto and other manufacturers paid $180 million, a substantial sum but distributed among thousands of plaintiffs, working out to relatively small individual payments. The Vietnamese, who received far higher exposures and had no legal recourse in U.S. courts, received nothing from manufacturers until decades later, and even then only limited humanitarian assistance rather than legal compensation. Having profited from Agent Orange, Monsanto pivoted to agricultural chemicals for peacetime markets. In 1970, chemist John E. Franz discovered glyphosate's herbicidal properties. Monsanto patented it and began selling it in 1974 under the brand name Roundup. Unlike Agent Orange, Roundup was marketed as environmentally friendly. It targeted plants, broke down relatively quickly compared to older herbicides like DDT, and had low acute toxicity to mammals. Farmers embraced it. Homeowners used it on lawns and gardens. It became ubiquitous. Monsanto's real innovation came in the 1990s with Roundup Ready crops. Using genetic modification, Monsanto created soybeans, corn, cotton, and other crops resistant to glyphosate. Farmers could plant these seeds, then spray entire fields with Roundup to kill weeds while the crops survived. This was hugely convenient. It simplified weed control dramatically, but it also meant farmers became dependent on buying Monsanto seeds and Monsanto's herbicide year after year. The seeds were patented, genetically modified to be terminating. They couldn't be saved and replanted. Farmers had to return to Monsanto for each planting. Monsanto aggressively defended its patents, suing farmers suspected of saving seeds or whose fields were inadvertently contaminated by cross pollination from neighboring Roundup ready crops. The company employed investigators who collected samples and pursued legal action. This created a climate of fear and resentment, but it also ensured market dominance. By the 2000s, Monsanto controlled a near monopoly on genetically modified crop seeds, and as adoption of Roundup ready crops expanded, glyphosate use exploded. Between 2004 and 2014, glyphosate use more than doubled, with that decade accounting for 2/3 of total glyphosate applied since Roundup launched. But questions about glyphosate's safety persisted. Some independent researchers found concerning results in animal studies. Some farmers and agricultural workers reported health problems. Monsanto consistently dismissed these concerns, pointing to regulatory approvals and its own studies showing glyphosate was safe. The EPA, heavily influenced by industry lobbying, maintained that glyphosate was not likely carcinogenic to humans. Then in 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IRCO, part of the World Health Organization, issued a report classifying glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to humans, Group 2A, indicating strong evidence from animal studies and limited evidence from human epidemiology. The report was based on comprehensive review of all available research. It found that glyphosate exposure increased risk of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, that it caused DNA damage in human cells, and that the evidence of genotoxicity and carcinogenicity in animals was substantial. Monsanto's response was furious. The company attacked the IARC finding aggressively, funding counter studies, pressuring scientists, lobbying regulators. Internal documents later revealed through litigation show Monsanto worked behind the scenes to discredit the IARC researchers. Ghost wrote scientific papers that appeared under academics' names but were actually drafted by Monsanto staff and coordinated with EPA officials to suppress or rewrite the agency's own assessments when they suggested cancer risks. One internal email written by a Monsanto executive to EPA officials stated, "We need EPA to quickly, like first thing tomorrow, say the following: that consumer products sold under the Teflon brand are safe, and to date, there are no human health effects known to be caused by PFOA." The email reveals corporate expectation that regulators would act as extensions of company public relations rather than independent protectors of public health. Lawsuits began in 2015. Thousands of plaintiffs, farmers, landscapers, gardeners, agricultural workers, claimed that years of Roundup exposure caused their cancers, specifically non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The cases were consolidated into multi-district litigation. Monsanto argued that glyphosate was safe, that EPA approval preempted state tort claims, and that plaintiffs' science was unreliable. But as discovery proceeded, internal documents emerged showing Monsanto had known for decades that glyphosate likely caused cancer, had worked to suppress that information, and had actively manipulated the scientific literature to create false controversy. The first trial, in 2018, involved Dwayne Lee Johnson, a former school groundskeeper who had used Roundup extensively as part of his job. He developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and by the time of trial, his doctors gave him months to live. The jury heard evidence of Johnson's exposure, his disease progression, and Monsanto's decades of knowledge and deception. After deliberating, they awarded $289 million, $39 million in compensatory damages for Johnson's suffering and lost income, $250 million in punitive damages to punish Monsanto's conduct. The judge later reduced the punitive damages, but the verdict stood. A jury had found that Roundup caused Johnson's cancer and that Monsanto had failed to adequately warn consumers. More verdicts followed. In 2019, a jury awarded $2 billion to a couple who both developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma after decades of using Roundup on their property. That verdict was also reduced on appeal, but the pattern was clear. Juries who heard the evidence consistently found Monsanto liable. By 2020, Bayer, which had acquired Monsanto in 2018 for $63 billion, faced more than 125,000 Roundup claims. The company settled most for approximately $10 billion, though it continued denying Roundup caused cancer. The Roundup litigation has produced internal documents showing Monsanto's tactics in detail. They ghostwrote scientific papers favorable to glyphosate, then recruited academics to publish them under their own names, creating the appearance of independent research. They paid consultants to write regulatory review articles that systematically dismiss negative studies while highlighting positive ones. They worked directly with EPA officials to shape the agency's cancer assessments, at times literally editing the language in EPA reports. They hired scientists to publicly attack the IRC researchers. They funded front groups that appeared independent but were actually Monsanto-controlled advocacy organizations. These tactics parallel tobacco industry methods from decades earlier. The core strategy is manufacturing scientific controversy. Legitimate research showing harm is countered by industry-funded research showing safety. Conflicting findings create the appearance of uncertainty, which delays regulation. Media coverage presents both sides, as if legitimate scientific consensus is equally balanced with industry propaganda. Regulators, dependent on industry for funding and data, err on the side of approving products rather than restricting them. The result is decades of delay while the harmful product remains on market and profits accumulate. Monsanto's broader legacy includes environmental damage beyond human health. Glyphosate-resistant superweeds evolved as natural selection favored plants that could survive repeated glyphosate exposure. Farmers responded by spraying more herbicide and combining glyphosate with other, more toxic chemicals. Biodiversity collapsed in heavily farmed areas. Insect populations crashed. Soil microorganism communities were disrupted. The promised simplicity of Roundup-ready farming turned into an escalating arms race between herbicides and evolving weeds, with environmental consequences that will persist for generations. Additionally, Monsanto's aggressive patent enforcement and control over seed supply gave it extraordinary power over global agriculture. Farmers became dependent on purchasing seeds annually. Traditional seed-saving practices, passed down for millennia, became illegal patent violations. When Monsanto sued farmers whose fields were contaminated by cross-pollination from neighboring Roundup-ready crops, the legal system sided with Monsanto's patents over farmers' claims of accidental contamination. This corporate control over the genetic basis of food production represents a fundamental shift in agricultural power dynamics, from farmers as custodians of crop genetics to corporations as owners. Monsanto's evolution from Agent Orange manufacturer to agricultural biotech giant demonstrates how corporations can commit atrocities, face limited consequences, rebrand, and continue operating while accumulating new liabilities. The same company that helped poison Vietnam, knowing dioxin caused birth defects and cancer, went on to blanket the world with another chemical causing cancer, all while denying harm and suppressing evidence. When accountability arrived in the form of massive lawsuits, Monsanto had already been acquired by Bayer, which absorbed the litigation burden along with Monsanto's profitable products. Bayer, facing billions in Roundup costs, has sought to limit future liability through various legal and legislative strategies. They've lobbied for laws preempting state tort claims. They've pushed for class action settlements with global release provisions barring future plaintiffs from suing. They've argued that EPA approval of glyphosate should prevent lawsuits based on failure to warn. These efforts mirror DuPont's corporate restructuring, attempting to use legal mechanisms to avoid full accountability for documented harm. What makes Monsanto particularly relevant to the umbrella corporation comparison is the integration of biological manipulation with chemical harm. Umbrella created viruses and modified organisms as weapons. Monsanto created genetically modified crops designed to withstand toxic chemicals, then flooded the environment with those chemicals while denying they caused harm. Both involve reshaping biology for profit. Both involve suppressing evidence of danger. Both involve regulatory capture and scientific manipulation. The difference is that Monsanto's genetic engineering was agricultural rather than viral, and its victims number in the thousands rather than triggering zombie apocalypses. But the fundamental ethics, altering life forms and poisoning populations for profit, align eerily closely. Monsanto also exemplifies how environmental damage can be as significant as direct human harm. The contamination DuPont caused is persistent but relatively localized. Tobacco's harm is primarily individual. Monsanto's impact is systemic and ecological. Glyphosate residues in soil, water, and food chains affect organisms beyond the target weeds. Genetically modified genes escape into wild plant populations through cross-pollination. The consolidation of seed ownership fundamentally changes agricultural systems globally. These aren't accidents or unintended consequences. They're the predictable results of designing agricultural systems around corporate control and chemical dependency, then dismissing or suppressing evidence of harm when it emerges. Today, glyphosate remains the world's most widely used herbicide despite the controversies. Bayer continues selling Roundup. Glyphosate-based products are available in hardware stores, garden centers, and agricultural supply companies. Residues are found in common foods, cereals, breads, vegetables. The chemical is in the bodies of most people reading this, and while tens of thousands have filed lawsuits and some have won substantial judgments, and scientific evidence has accumulated linking glyphosate to cancer, the EPA still approves its use. Regulators in many countries still classify it as safe. The system that allowed Monsanto to operate as it did continues functioning largely unchanged, ensuring that the next chemical company facing similar questions about its products will have the same playbook available: deny, delay, suppress, and profit until forced to stop. Conclusion: the pattern of corporate atrocity. 7 examples. Different industries, different decades, different countries. Unit 731 in Manchuria, Tuskegee in Alabama, MK Ultra across America, IG Farben in Nazi Germany, Big Tobacco globally, DuPont in West Virginia, Monsanto's reach extending worldwide, each unique in specifics. but the pattern is depressingly consistent. The same structure repeats itself across all of them, a template for how organizations, whether military units, government agencies, or profit seeking corporations, transform from benign institutions into engines of atrocity while maintaining facades of respectability. The pattern begins with knowledge. In every case, the perpetrating organization knew its actions caused severe harm, not suspected, not wondered about, but knew with certainty backed by internal research, medical records, or direct observation. Unit 731's doctors watched prisoners die on operating tables. Tuskegee researchers tracked disease progression that could have been cured. CIA officials read reports of permanent psychological damage in MK Ultra subjects. IG Farben executives toured Auschwitz and saw slave laborers dying. Tobacco company scientists documented nicotine addiction and cancer causation. DuPont toxicologists identified C8's health effects. Monsanto researchers understood glyphosate's carcinogenic potential. The knowledge existed, documented in internal files, discussed in meetings, understood by decision makers. Yet the knowledge remained internal. The second consistent element is systematic concealment. These organizations didn't passively fail to share what they knew. They actively worked to ensure knowledge stayed hidden. They destroyed documents. They intimidated whistleblowers. They moved research into classified projects or proprietary files. They lied to regulators. They manipulated peer review. They ghostwrote studies. They created front organizations to simulate independent research. They coordinated with government officials to suppress investigations. The concealment was methodical and comprehensive, requiring planning and resources. Third is the continuation and often escalation of harm after knowledge was established. The atrocities didn't stop when evidence of damage emerged. They intensified. Unit 731 expanded operations after confirming experiments were lethal. Tuskegee continued for decades after penicillin became available. MK Ultra escalated dosing when initial experiments showed permanent harm. IG Farben increased production of Zyklon B as death camp operations accelerated. Tobacco companies expanded marketing after confirming cigarettes caused cancer. DuPont increased C8 production after discovering water contamination. Monsanto promoted Roundup globally while suppressing cancer links. In each case, knowledge of harm triggered not cessation but acceleration, a deliberate choice to maximize profit or data collection during the window before accountability arrived. Fourth, the targeting of vulnerable populations. None of these organizations experimented on their own leadership or harmed their own interests. Unit 731 targeted Chinese civilians and Soviet POWs considered subhuman. Tuskegee targeted impoverished black men with limited health care access. MK Ultra targeted prisoners, mental patients, and marginalized individuals who couldn't refuse or report what happened. IG Farben used concentration camp prisoners who had no legal rights. Tobacco companies marketed heavily to children, minorities, and populations in developing countries with weak regulation. DuPont contaminated working class communities without resources to investigate or litigate. Monsanto's agricultural workers and farmers bore the health burdens of glyphosate exposure. The pattern is explicit. Identify populations without power, voice, or protection, then use them to absorb the risks while elites collect the benefits. Fifth is regulatory capture or immunity. In no case did robust oversight prevent or stop the atrocities. Government agencies that should have intervened either collaborated, looked away, or were compromised through political pressure and lobbying. The U.S. government granted Unit 731 immunity in exchange for data. The Public Health Service operated Tuskegee as an official program. The CIA conducted MK Ultra with presidential approval. Nazi Germany's government partnered with IG Farben. Tobacco companies captured regulatory agencies through former officials joining industry and vice versa. DuPont operated for decades before EPA enforcement. Monsanto coordinated directly with EPA officials to shape cancer assessments. Regulatory failure is consistent across examples, suggesting that oversight alone cannot prevent institutional atrocity when the institution is powerful enough to influence or circumvent its regulators. Sixth, when exposure finally arrived, accountability was limited and delayed. Unit 731's leaders faced no prosecution. Tuskegee researchers continued their careers. MK Ultra participants destroyed evidence and retired comfortably. IG Farben executives received minimal prison sentences and returned to industry leadership. Tobacco company CEOs avoided criminal charges despite perjury. DuPont paid fines representing tiny fractions of profits and restructured to avoid future liability. Monsanto was acquired by Bayer before major judgments arrived. In almost no case did the individuals who made decisions to harm others face consequences proportional to the harm inflicted. Financial penalties existed but rarely threatened corporate survival. Criminal prosecutions were absent or minimal. The people most directly responsible usually escaped justice. Seventh and finally, the organizations often continued existing. Unit 731's personnel dispersed into academia and government. Public Health Service survived Tuskegee and still exists as part of CDC. The CIA continues operating despite MK Ultra. IG Farben split into companies that became BASF and Bayer, now respectable corporations. Tobacco companies still operate globally. DuPont restructured but continues under various names. Monsanto was absorbed by Bayer and lives on through its products. Institutional survival is the norm. Dissolution or destruction of the perpetrating organization is rare. Society seems willing to forgive institutional crimes that would result in life imprisonment if committed by individuals. These patterns reveal something disturbing about how modern institutions operate. The organizations that committed these atrocities weren't aberrations. They were mainstream, respected entities following standard business and bureaucratic practices. The evil emerged not from individual moral failure, though individual decisions mattered, but from institutional structures that made atrocity logical. When profit maximization is the primary goal, when quarterly reports matter more than long-term consequences, when externalities aren't counted as costs, then poisoning populations becomes rational business. When national security justifies any action, when enemies are dehumanized sufficiently, when classification prevents oversight, then human experimentation becomes acceptable research. When career advancement depends on not questioning directives, when legal liability is minimized through document destruction, when regulatory agencies serve industry rather than public, then systematic harm becomes standard operation. This is what makes our real umbrella corporations so much more disturbing than fiction. In Resident Evil, Umbrella is obviously evil. The executives know they're villains. The shadowy board meetings, the secret labs, the willingness to destroy cities, all of it screams malevolence. Players fighting Umbrella are clearly on the right side, but in reality, the umbrella corporations convince themselves they're heroes. Tobacco executives believed they were providing pleasure to adults who chose to smoke. DuPont executives believed they were advancing materials science. Monsanto executives believed they were feeding the world. Unit 731 researchers believed they were serving their nation. CIA officials believed they were protecting democracy. Everyone justified their atrocities through frameworks that made them seem necessary, justified, even noble. That's the real horror. Not that monsters exist, but that ordinary people become monsters when placed in institutional contexts that reward monstrous behavior. The pharmaceutical researcher who falsifies data isn't evil. He's responding to career incentives. The executive who suppresses evidence of harm isn't malicious. She's protecting shareholder value. The regulator who approves dangerous products isn't corrupt. He's following agency capture patterns established over decades. The system itself generates atrocity without requiring individual villainy. And that system remains largely intact, ready to produce the next Unit 731, the next Tuskegee, the next chemical catastrophe. What can be learned from these examples? First, that waiting for institutions to self-regulate is insufficient. Every organization examined here had internal warnings, ethical concerns, and evidence that should have triggered change, yet change never came from within. External pressure, litigation, whistleblowers, investigative journalism, public outrage was necessary in every case. Institutions will not voluntarily limit their own power or profit. Accountability must be imposed from outside through laws with teeth, regulations enforced vigorously, and consequences severe enough to actually deter. Second, document destruction must be treated as evidence of guilt. Throughout these cases, the organizations destroyed records specifically to avoid accountability. MKUltra's file destruction prevented full investigation. Tobacco companies shredded documents during litigation. DuPont systematically destroyed materials. The practice is so common, it should trigger automatic assumption that the Sahe destroyed documents contained damning evidence. Laws should treat deliberate destruction during investigations as admission of liability, shifting burden of proof to the organization to demonstrate innocence, rather than requiring plaintiffs to prove guilt without access to evidence. Third, personal accountability matters. When executives face no criminal charges, when researchers face no professional consequences, when officials face no prosecution, the lesson learned is that institutional atrocity carries no personal risk. If you're deciding whether to suppress evidence of harm, and you know that even if caught, you'll face at most some fines paid by the company, and perhaps early retirement with a pension, that's not deterrence. Criminal penalties for decision makers, prison time, not just fines, would change calculus dramatically. The executives who approved Tuskegee continuing after penicillin existed committed what should have been criminalized medical malpractice. The CIA officials who destroyed MKUltra files committed obstruction. The tobacco executives who lied to Congress committed perjury. The DuPont executives who concealed water contamination committed environmental crimes. None saw prison. Until individuals face personal consequences, institutional behavior won't change. Fourth, corporate restructuring to avoid liability must be illegal. The ability to spin off liabilities into smaller entities that can declare bankruptcy or to dissolve and reform under new names while maintaining the same assets and operations creates a get out of jail free card for corporate crimes. DuPont's Chemours split, tobacco companies' various mergers and reorganizations, Bayer absorbing Monsanto's liabilities. These maneuvers allow corporations to shed accountability while preserving profits. Laws should treat liability as permanently attached to assets and successor organizations. If you buy a company, you buy its liabilities. If you spin off a division, Both entities remain liable. Corporate personhood shouldn't include the person right to bankruptcy discharge when that discharge is structured specifically to avoid paying victims. Fifth, regulatory capture must be continuously guarded against. The pattern of agencies serving industries they're meant to regulate is consistent enough to be structural rather than incidental. EPA officials editing glyphosate reports at Monsanto's request. FDA officials joining pharmaceutical companies after approval decisions. This revolving door between industry and regulation ensures agencies will always err toward approving products rather than restricting them. Cooling off periods preventing regulators from joining regulated industries should be extended to a decade or more. Financial conflicts should trigger automatic recusal, and funding for regulatory science should come from general revenue, not industry fees, to eliminate financial dependence that creates implicit pressure to approve. Sixth, international accountability mechanisms need strengthening. Many of these cases involve activities crossing borders. Unit 731 operated in occupied territory. Tobacco and chemical companies marketed globally. Agent Orange was used in Vietnam, yet national courts struggle with jurisdiction and enforcement. International tribunals with real enforcement power, capable of prosecuting corporate crimes against humanity as seriously as military ones, might create accountability where national systems fail. The fact that IG Farben executives face Nuremberg trials while tobacco executives who arguably killed more people faced only civil litigation suggests a gap in international law that should be addressed. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the fiction we tell ourselves about corporations must change. We're taught that corporations are neutral mechanisms for organizing economic activity efficiently, that market competition ensures quality, that regulation prevents abuse, that publicness creates accountability. These examples demolish those comfortable myths. Corporations are powerful institutions that, when pursuing profit or power, will harm people systematically if allowed to do so. Markets failed to prevent any of these atrocities. Regulation was captured or insufficient in every case. Public disclosure didn't prevent deception. The lesson is that corporations are neither inherently good nor neutral. They're goal-seeking entities that will optimize for whatever metrics drive them, and if those metrics don't include human welfare as a hard constraint, human welfare will be sacrificed. The umbrella corporation is fiction. We can fight zombies and bioweapons in games, narratives comfortingly clear-cut with obvious villains and righteous heroes. But the real umbrella corporations documented here are worse precisely because they're mundane. They advertised on television. They employed our neighbors. Their products sat in our homes. The people who ran them looked like anyone else, lived normal lives, attended churches, and raised children, and considered themselves good citizens. And that ordinariness is the horror, the realization that under the right circumstances, ordinary institutions and ordinary people will commit extraordinary evil, and that society's mechanisms for preventing or punishing such evil are woefully inadequate. These 7 examples are not ancient history. Tobacco companies still sell cigarettes. DuPont's PFAS contamination persists in our bodies and will for our lifetimes. Roundup remains on shelves despite the cancer links. The regulatory agencies that failed to prevent these atrocities still regulate with similar authorities and similar vulnerabilities to capture. The corporate structures that enabled liability avoidance still exist. The legal frameworks that resulted in minimal accountability haven't substantially changed. Nothing about the institutional context that generated these umbrella corporations has been fundamentally reformed. which means the next one is likely already operating, creating the next catastrophe we won't learn about until documents emerge decades from now. That's the final lesson. The Umbrella Corporation isn't a warning about the future, it's a mirror of the present and past. The corporations that will poison our children and grandchildren are probably doing it right now, suppressing the evidence, capturing the regulators, planning their liability dodges. We won't know which ones until the whistleblower comes forward, the lawsuit breaks open the files, the journalist connects the pieces. And when we learn the truth, society will react with shock and outrage, act as if this is unprecedented, prosecute a few individuals lightly or not at all, fine the corporation a fraction of its profits, implement modest reforms, and move on. The pattern will repeat because we've seen it repeat 7 times in this accounting alone, and hundreds of times more across the full history of industrial civilization. The umbrella corporations are real, they always have been, and until we fundamentally change how we allow institutions to operate, they always will be. Sleep well, knowing that the monsters aren't in the game. They're in the boardrooms, the laboratories, the government offices. They wear suits instead of lab coats spattered with zombie blood. They kill with chemicals and deception rather than viruses and violence. And they're probably insured, diversified, and trading on the stock market while planning their next quarter's earnings call. The horror is real. The horror has always been real. And the most frightening part is that nobody thinks they're the villain.